Hello, everybody. I'm really excited today to have with us Mark Cushing from the Animal Policy Group to chat with us about the veterinarian of record relationship, the relationship between animal organizations and veterinarians, and legalities and law items. So, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're really excited to hear from you today.
My pleasure.
So,
Eager to talk about an important subject. So,
awesome. We'll start off by telling us about you. What is the Animal Policy Group, and why is this topic something that you'd be an expert in?
the Animal Policy Group is a for-profit organization, a professional service organization that I created back in the 2010, 11, and 12 era. I'm an attorney. I practiced as a courtroom business lawyer for many years, and then ended up as a partner in a large international law firm in the Washington, D.C. office, and got involved with a large coalition of pet-related healthcare and educational interests in 2006 and 7, and solved a problem in Congress that they wanted solved. And it led to being asked to do a lot of things in the industry, from a legal, regulatory, and political aspect, both lobbying as well as advocacy in general. And that's produced now a 14-member group called the Animal Policy Group. I live in Paradise Valley, Arizona, next to Scottsdale, and the team is all over the country. I have one other attorney beside myself. We're not a law firm, but I'm a licensed attorney and still active as a lawyer. But I do things in addition to being a traditional lawyer, and have 50 plus clients across the whole pet related space: healthcare, nutrition, pharmaceutical, diagnostic, retail, veterinary schools, veterinary school accreditation. I was co-founder of the Veterinary Innovation Council and co-founder of the Veterinary Virtual Care Association. So I'm very active inside the industry on advocacy and policy issues. We cover all 50 state legislators, boards of veterinary medicine, and boards of pharmacy for interests related to pet healthcare. And I was fortunate enough to meet Mal Schwartz and become familiar with Shelters United, and was happy to help them when the call came out, or came to me rather, to address this interesting issue of veterinarian of record.
Well, we are honored to have you here, and I'm going to jump right into what you just said. It certainly is interesting, and it is certainly complicated and not as black and white, I think, as we'd like to think about. This entire toolkit is about the relationship between veterinarians and animal shelters, and that has a lot of meat to it. So why don't we start with how local and state laws impact this relationship?
Sure, and I probably should have added in my introduction that I'm also author of Pet Nation, which was the one book that's looked at the evolution in American society, and frankly, a transformative evolution of the relationship of Americans to pets. So, which gives you some perspective on how I look at things. So, veterinarians are governed almost entirely at the state level. That is, their licenses are issued by state boards of veterinary medicine, which are created by state legislatures, and they live by the rules and regulations state boards pass, as well as the laws that legislatures pass that go into the Veterinary Practice Act. This is typical of professions in the U.S., the same for doctors, lawyers, dentists, architects, engineers, and the like. So they're not licensed at the federal government level, but at the state level, number one. And the requirement to be licensed always includes two things. One is that you've graduated from an accredited program, and secondly, that you pass the national board exam called the NAVLE, N-A-V-L-E. And again, that's typical of professions that have an accreditation requirement for your degree, as well as a board passage to prove that you learned something in school besides where the best restaurants are in your town. So that's the world veterinarians live in. Local laws come into play in a much less important way. Why is that? They may govern the real estate that you practice in, where the clinic may be. If you're a nonprofit, there'll be some local laws governing nonprofits, some state laws as well. Animal welfare considerations govern shelters, rescues in a heavy way. Those are typically more local than state. They don't affect veterinarians as much unless they're practicing inside of a shelter or a rescue. But there are certain animal welfare principles, of course, that affect everyone in terms of the humane treatment of animals. But that's where they live. There's some federal oversight of veterinarians related to the use of FDA-approved drugs. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, which is a federal entity. But in the companion animal space that we're talking about today, it's really a state overseen profession. And that's where laws come into effect that play out with what's called the veterinarian of record.
So we have spent a lot of time in this toolkit talking to both the veterinarian and the animal shelter, because there does feel like there is a disconnect, and we have heard that a lot from both sides. We have heard the veterinarian is concerned about their licensure, and they are concerned about policies and procedures, and the animal shelter has needs that they don't always feel that the veterinarian understands, because it's a different type of veterinary medicine. And that kind of takes us into things like terms like the VCPR and some other terms that we often talk about when we're looking at this relationship. Can you talk a little bit more about that piece and why the shelter needs to care about this and why the veterinarian needs to communicate with the shelter on it?
The place that a veterinarian practices is of little importance to the law. The law governing veterinarians pertains in almost every instance to the individual animal. In this case, we'll refer to pet, the individual pet with whom the veterinarian plays some role in its medical care. So it's not their employment relationship to a clinic, their employment relationship to a shelter, their advisory or volunteer role they might play. It's all focused on protecting the public in terms of the care of the individual pet that the veterinarian has agreed to take responsibility for. The awkward sounding term, but it's actually a pretty simple term with the abbreviation VCPR, is a veterinary client-patient relationship. So you have three parties involved. You have the veterinarian who's got a license, and she's been asked, presumably, to take care of some particular animal's needs. You've got the client, which is the pet owner in a traditional context. We often use the term now, the modern phrase pet parent, but it's the owner of the pet. And then the patient, of course, is the pet itself. Different than the doctor-patient relationship in human medicine, where there's no owner of the person, obviously. So there's just the person who's the patient and the doctor. Now, the question of, in a shelter context, in a rescue context, who owns the animal? And the law deems that to be the shelter or the rescue for the time that the pet is in their care. So whether it's a stray or whether it's been someone that's been relinquished by a pet owner, or kittens or puppies born on the premises of a rescue or a shelter, for that period of time that they're in the shelter, and we'll use shelter just to not always say shelter or rescue, but it applies to both. They're deemed to be the owner, right? So the veterinarian's relationship, which is viewed through the prism or the lens, if you will, of the individual responsibility she's taken on to care for a pet. Now, a veterinarian advising a shelter saying, I'll give you some good ideas, some recommendations, some suggestions, and so forth, but they're not taking care of pets individually in the shelter or in their own clinic, but brought to them by the shelter. The law doesn't have much to say about that, because they've not been deemed to create this VCPR. The VCPR is when you have seen a pet. In some states through telemedicine, that's fine. In some states, it has to be in person. And you've taken on the responsibility of passing judgment, if you will, on what their condition is and making recommendations through a diagnosis or a prognosis. and ultimately prescribing medications or conducting surgery. That's kind of the space. Diagnosis, prognosis, prescription flowing from your diagnosis or prognosis, and surgery possibly flowing from all the above. So from a veterinarian standpoint, in working with a shelter, the challenge is this. It's one thing if the veterinarian's going to the shelter or rescue or asking the pets to be brought to them, and they're caring for individual dogs, individual cats, just to use those two most common examples. And they are now held to the same standard they would be if a private family brought their treasured Labradoodle puppy to them and we're paying them $1,000. To the payment of money doesn't affect the relationship. So whether it's a client paying you to take care or you've agreed to take care for a shelter for money or not, you've agreed to care for an individual animal. And there's no such thing as general liability that I'm going to help a shelter and all the animals' medical condition in that shelter I'm legally responsible for. No. Now, shelters themselves as organizations taking on the task of caring for 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 pets in their care, there's no laws that are that specific about shelter duties as much as they're responsible for all that happens in their premises. And so they're responsible for the animals that they have in their care. But they're the owner. So the challenge usually is an owner saying, a veterinarian made a mistake in the care of my animal, surgery caused injury or sadly death in some cases, and I want compensation. I want you to be held accountable. And accountability happens in one of two ways. The State Board of Veterinary Medicine exists mainly for this reason. If you're a member of the public and you have an animal and it's in your mind been harmed by a veterinarian, you come to us and you can complain, not verbally, but write us and tell us what happened. And we will investigate this now. And we may take the license of that veterinarian away. We may fine the veterinarian a certain amount of money. We may suspend their license for a year or two, or we may conclude that you're wrong. They didn't do anything negligent and nothing happens to the veterinarian and they continue on in their practice. So that's the principle number one. And it's crucial because it is the disconnect between shelters and veterinarians' relationship. What's the disconnect again, put in a more clear, non-lawyer way? The shelter can't place on a veterinarian responsibility for all the decisions the shelter makes, including an animal possibly getting harmed or dying inside the shelter's care, unless the veterinarian herself was the agent of the care that was given that caused the problems, right? A veterinarian, however, can be nervous about working with or uncertain about working with a shelter or rescue because they may fear that they've taken on the liability for the medical status of all the animals in their care. Now, we're not talking here, as you know, about the staff veterinarian that's hired by a major urban shelter who has the funding to have a staff and have a clinic. That's different. But we're talking about the veterinarian who practices down the street at Green Meadows Animal Clinic, and they come in once a month in some capacity to help the shelter. Now, when they do that, when they're in the shelter and they're taking care of an animal, it's no different than if it's an animal who's in their clinic and is a client animal. So there's liability there and responsibility for a veterinarian, and it doesn't go away because they're doing something good, if you will, and noble by helping an underfunded shelter or rescue. But that's the nub. Now, from a shelter standpoint, if they don't have the funding to hire a veterinarian, what do they have to do? They have to convince a veterinarian to help us. And here's the deal. Many veterinarians will, just as many lawyers provide free legal service to low-income Americans that can't afford a lawyer but have legal issues that they have to deal with. And many will. But the veterinarian does not get a free pass. Julie, as you know, they don't get a free pass from liability when they go to a shelter and care for an individual animal. They're held accountable if something goes wrong. So the challenge with the veterinarian of record, and I'm probably anticipating your next question, is this. We have a business practice, not a legal practice, but a business practice of distributors who connect the manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, approved drugs, approved by the FDA, who have a business practice of delivering from manufacturer location A. The distributor B delivers the prescriptions to the veterinarian wherever they're practicing so they can use them, right? And we've learned, as I understand it, I've never investigated this personally, but I've taken on faith from the Shelter United team, a great team, by the way, that those distributors will charge one price to take it to a veterinary clinic, and it's a lower price than if they would take it to a shelter or a rescue that doesn't have a staff veterinarian. So they pay a premium, they pay a higher price, and they can least afford to. So they're in this awkward position of we're caring more for the animals than anybody else because we don't have the ability to hire a full-time vet. And medications are necessary for the care of living beings, whether it's people or pets. And we can't get the medications we need because the cost of those medications is higher. So could you give us the benefit of the pricing you give private clinics? Now, private clinics, let's think about that. The clinic itself, whether it's a partnership, a corporation, whether it's owned by a veterinarian or owned by a corporation, doesn't matter. They pay the distributor for delivery of the pharmaceuticals, right? Just as a grocery store pays for the delivery of all the food a grocery store sells, right? They pay for it. They're expected to. Every veterinarian that works in that clinic is not legally liable for if something goes wrong with how any of those medications are used. But the one veterinarian who cares for the pet, who misapplied, used the wrong drug, or the dosage was handled improperly, will be held liable, right? But the transaction, when I call this a business issue, the transaction that prices it much lower is a function of the distributor comfortable that, okay, this is going to a clinic, veterinarians work there. In the other case, this is going to a shelter or rescue, veterinarians don't work there. So now we're concerned about non-licensed veterinarians having access to medications who they may misprescribe, right? Put aside the issue whether they use the drugs for themselves. We're not talking about that scenario. So that's the complication, right? So the veterinarian of record inspiration that Shelter United's had, which I really compliment them for putting their shoulder into this and their creativity, is can we get private practice veterinarians to provide their name and license as a showing a relationship to the shelter or rescue that would cause the distributor to go, all right, there's a veterinarian quote involved in that shelter or rescue. We're going to give you the lower price because we're not as concerned that there's going to be misuse or improper use, not misuse like criminal, but just negligent use of the drugs. That's the rub of the problem, right? And so then you have to get into and you may wonder, does this person ever take a breath? But I am a jury lawyer, so I've given long jury arguments, and I'm not reading from notes here. I'm just telling you what I know. So the rub of the argument is a veterinarian who agrees to do that because the distributor has said that's fine. Has she taken on a special liability for the use of those drugs in that shelter or rescue, even though she doesn't work there, she's not paid by them necessarily, and she didn't see them in her clinic, but just she's responsible for staff who she might have helped think about it and understand what they need to do. And by the way, staff should be extremely careful in these circumstances, but nevertheless, is she liable? And here's the grand finale of the law school question here. We know that in all states but New Mexico, there's a statute in a section of the Veterinary Practice Act, the law passed by the legislature, that says the terms of that law overseeing how veterinarians practice do not apply to a person taking care of an animal they own. This has an origin in farm and particularly the ranching in the West, where they may be 1,000 miles from a veterinarian, but you've got a herd of 500 cattle that need care. And veterinarians will tell you that ranchers are sometimes smarter and better veterinarians than veterinarians. They're forced to take care of their animals, but they're not legally liable to a veterinary medical board for practicing without a license, right? If they own the animal. Well, guess how the law looks at shelters and rescues? They own the animals in their care. So non-veterinarians in the shelter are authorized to take care of the pets. Good that they are, right? You know, in other words, they're deemed to own them, and they can't tiptoe around being legally liable with every step they take, particularly if they don't have funds to hire a vet. So that's the way it works out. That seems to be clear. I've described, 2 or 3 different scenarios, but the question that has to be answered for the Shelter United Veterinarian of Record program to succeed is what? That there could be a private practice veterinarian who says, I'll be the veterinarian of record for a purchase order of so much gabapentin or so much, various drugs that are used, for small animal care. But do not hold me legally liable for what happens to a pet in that rescue or shelter from the use of that drug that I'm of record for, unless I was the doctor who saw the pet and administered it. And that's, to me, a solvable problem. But I know that lawyers on all sides could spend hours in an interview with you discussing theoretically what could go wrong with this model. And that's kind of the issue that I've been working with Shelter United to try to address.
Woo, lot to unpack there.
Before
I move on to the next topic, though, I just want to make sure that I understood correctly. So are you saying, am I hearing you correctly, that the liability lies on the veterinarian only if they were the VCPR for that particular animal? Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, with one footnote or exception, and the law is full of footnotes and exceptions, so don't be surprised. And I know you're not offended by it because you're a very sophisticated, experienced leader. So the veterinarian, if she told the staff, okay, here's how you handle drug XYZ, and this is what you should do, and these are the doses, and that advice itself was negligent and didn't reflect the standard of care that should be applied, they could be held liable. If they
what if the staff has, say, a written policy and procedure, but they don't follow it?
If they have a written policy procedure, they don't follow it, and the veterinarian didn't tell them, don't worry about following it, just trust your instincts. The veterinarian's moving into some quicksand or murky waters there. But if the veterinarian's careful and says, and this is what I've recommended to Shelter United, that the veterinarian says, if I see the pet either in my clinic or at your premises, I'm responsible. I'm not trying to avoid that. However, if something happens to the pet from the medication that I haven't administered, I'm going to nevertheless give you some basic guidelines for you to follow that are good practice guidelines. And those are well thought out and consistent with sort of standards of practice that veterinarians understand. Then she's gone a long way to ensure that she has no liability if something goes wrong. So the problem is what? If you said to me, Mark, you've got 30 seconds, not 20, 25 minutes to outline a problem. The problem is this: you have a business relationship with the sole goal of lowering the cost of medications for underfunded shelters and rescues, superimposed on a Veterinary Practice Act rules, if you will, regarding liability of veterinarians, and they don't resemble each other. The Practice Act doesn't contemplate this relationship. It doesn't deal with business relationships. It deals with how you care for an individual animal, or in the case of a herd, if you're practicing herd medicine, but that's not the case here. I wouldn't think it would be. So that's our challenge. And I think it's entirely feasible. And I'll add a piece to this that's important. And I think I want to hear your thoughts too. I think it's entirely possible to make this arrangement work and achieve the goals rescues and shelters have of a lower cost. If you take the plan and you go to the State Board of Veterinary Medicine and say, we would like to have you review this plan and tell us if you will have any objections and in any manner impose a different standard of liability on the veterinarian than we contemplate. And I think most states would say, particularly if the state VMA was alongside, yes, I've got one of my lovely Bengal cats.
Looks like a raccoon tail.
Well, it's a Bengal, and an hour before he's supposed to get his next meal, a minimum of an hour, usually 2 hours, he's up on my Zooms, making sure that I know that I'm failing, that I'm not, that I'm liable, that I should be held liable for starving a rather well-fed Bengal puppy or Bengal kitty. So that's to me what I want to have happen is spell out the relationship clearly, take it to a state board and say, let's have a public meeting if you want. It doesn't have to be private. Let's sort this out so we can help animals in need and the good people taking care of them in rescues and shelters, but also not impose an extra layer of liability on a veterinarian. And to me, that's the solution that makes sense. And I think we'll have success with it.
Yeah, I do think that down the road, once this toolkit is used by the users, we're going to hear a lot of comments about what has working and what's getting in the way. And then we'll go to the next phase of this toolkit, which will then definitely be looking at state by state situations and issues. So I'm really excited about that. I do want to move on to the next topic, however, which is the importance of documenting whatever this relationship is, whatever the relationship looks like to the veterinarian as well as the shelter, whether it's an MOU or a contract, whatever you are putting together. What are the important things that need to go in there for the relationship to be successful?
Okay, I'll answer that with a qualification only that I'm not by training a contracts lawyer or a corporate lawyer. So the actual ultimate contract, I can talk about the key principles and features, but I would defer to a drafts person, if you will, that would draft it. So here's what you have to have. You identify it's an individual relationship of a veterinarian, not of a clinic. State boards of veterinary medicine don't impose liability on clinics. It's always an individual doctor. You may own my practice, but if I work for you and I'm the one that took care of Fluffy, my neighbor's pet dog, it's me and Fluffy, not the clinic and Fluffy. The clinic might help with insurance, right? It may say, we'll pay for your insurance.
We've lost your.
I don't know how.
Oh, you're back.
Okay,
We're good.
So anyway, the relationship is individual veterinarian to the clinic, to the shelter or rescue, number one. It's not clinic to. The clinic can endorse it. It can say that it'll try to provide insurance to protect the veterinarian if it wants, but it's a relationship of an individual veterinarian to the shelter or rescue, number one. Number two, you spell out exactly the services the veterinarian is going to provide in detail, and they could be, unique in each case, right? Or they could be generic, but they're usually going to be somewhat unique. You clarify what the veterinarian is not assuming liability for. You explicitly state that, and both parties acknowledge it. You clarify that both parties were advised by lawyers who have reviewed the agreement. You know, you're carefully stating what the agreement is in the relationship, characterizing the liability or not, specifically having both parties acknowledge that characterization specifically or not for purposes of liability, right? And you work through each element, and you have the addition of saying, if the veterinarian is going to be open to caring individually for pets, either at the rescue or shelter or in their clinic, you carve out and say, in those circumstances, the veterinarian acknowledges that she's bound by the State Veterinary Practice Act and the board's regulations and rules as to the care of the animal, you know, as she would be in any other case of a pet she's taking medical responsibility for. And you acknowledge specifically that unless the veterinarian does certain things, they have not created a VCPR unintentionally or accidentally with any pet in the care of the rescue or shelter. So you clarify that. And you can make it 20 pages, you can make it 3 pages, but it's pretty straightforward. And but my point is, and I view, frankly, everything I do in this light. There's a great quote about a misunderstood author 500-600 years ago by the name of Machiavelli, who's associated with all things evil, and that's a misunderstanding of him. For this reason, it was said about him, he names with precision that which is happening. So what you do here is you don't try to make things murky and vague. You precisely describe what's going to happen. The veterinarian is going to provide, for the benefit of the distributor, their veterinary license number with the state and their status to enable the shelter to get a better below market price for medications, period. You don't hide that that's what's going on. In so doing, it enables the shelter to get that better price and to use the medications as they deem fit, not the veterinarian deems fit. And everybody acknowledges that. So you're very precise about it, if you get what I mean. And you state this act of providing the license for purposes of the best price does not of itself create a VCPR or impose liability on the veterinarian's part, period. However, the veterinarian may go on or may not go on to provide detailed instructions for which she would be responsible if there's flaws or negligence involved in those instructions themselves.
So what I'm hearing is communication is really important and clarity is really important, and putting it in writing is really important so that there's no lack of understanding.
And having a separate lawyer advise each party, and you can find lawyers that would help the nonprofit shelter or rescue, and the clinics probably got their own lawyers anyway. And that's how you do it.
I think we can talk about this for hours, but we are definitely coming down to the end of our time. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important.
I think that the success of this is going to be a function of transparency, openness, and getting the state boards and the state VMAs involved. And they'll be nervous about, is the VMA taking on liability? No, you're not. You're just providing guidance. But let's not have any surprises here, number one. So open, transparent conversations with lawyers involved and not running everything is essential. And I think that the second most important feature that you're dealing with other interviews, I'm sure, and your overall role with the project is the crucial training of staff at the shelter and rescue and volunteers at the shelter and rescue about what they can and can't do, should and shouldn't do, and putting that in writing and have training sessions and reviewing those sessions every 3 months or every 6 months or every year at a minimum. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I think this can work. I think it'd be very easy to overcomplicate this and cause the veterinarian of record model not to go forward, and that would be a great loss. And it's an avoidable loss. So I'm eager to help walk anybody who needs to be walked through how this can work, because I'd like to see this happen.
That's a perfect place to end. Would you give people your email if they wanted to follow up with you?
Sure will. It's a long one. Mark, that's easy. MARK at animalpolicygroup.com.
Perfect.
That's all lowercase, one big long string of letters. And I'd welcome any questions and enjoyed the conversation. And I think you probably heard a 25-minute answer in there, and that may be a record, but I think
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. I do want to remind everybody that the toolkit has more detail on a lot of the topics that were discussed today. So make sure you go back to the website to take a look at some of these. We also have some real concrete examples. So we have an example of an MOU, we have a conflict of interest document, we have
Good.
all of the things that you might need in order to make this successful, including tips on communication and how to, we even have a staff and volunteer training document for you. So go back to the toolkit after watching this if you have more questions. But I do want to say thank you so much, Mark, for your time, for your expertise, and for taking on this project, because we definitely need somebody like you who has the knowledge and the passion to help us move forward with making this a program that's going to be successful for all. So thanks again for your time.
My pleasure, and good luck.